So there's just something hard about the holidays when you have lost somebody that was really important in your life. And you all know that I lost my mother a little over a year ago, and my father eats dinner at my house about 4 to 5 nights a week. And he has been asking me to make my mother's original lasagna recipe. So once I grew up and I, got my own house and started cooking my own way, I took my mother's original recipe and I changed it. I tried to fancy it up with ricotta cheese and fancy spices and doing all these things. And my dad said he enjoys my lasagna, but he really wants it my mother's way. So I got out my cookbook that I have had since I was in high school. It's a cookbook that I handwrite my favorite recipes, and I wrote my mother's original lasagna recipe in here 35 years ago probably, and I got it out, and I'm gonna make my mother's lasagna for my dad tonight. The only thing I am doing different, my mother used to make the tomato sauce with the beef in a pot on the stovetop. I've found that it's a lot easier to make it in the crock pot. So when I make spaghetti sauce, which is the exact same sauce you use in lasagna, I make a huge batch of it, and I made this a couple weeks ago. I've had it in the freezer just for this occasion. So I've already made the sauce version of this, but I will link the recipe in the description box. You can absolutely do it on the stovetop. You can do it in the crock pot like I choose to do, but this portion is already made. So I'm gonna defrost this, and then I'm gonna use my mother's original recipe and do all the layers of the lasagna. And back in the day, my mom used to make her lasagna with cottage cheese instead of ricotta cheese. That's exactly what I'm gonna do. So I remember eating my mother's lasagna when I was growing up, and that's what my dad and I are missing right now. We're missing her. I miss my mother. But I look around, I have her ribbon on my Christmas tree, touches of her throughout my house. I have ornaments that were on the Christmas tree when I was growing up. I now have those on my tree. And it's cold and snowy outside, and so it's a great night for my mother's original lasagna. So to get started, I'm gonna boil a pot of original lasagna noodles. None of that no bake, no boil noodle business. This is original noodles. I'm gonna boil 9 sheets of this. So your lasagna noodles need a lot of room to move around. So use a really big pot so that they can move and boil freely and not stick together. So my water is at a full boil, and I'm going to salt it really well. Big handful of kosher salt. And I know you're not supposed to do this nowadays, but back then my mother always put a little zhuzh of oil in her boiling water to make sure that the noodles did not stick together. And I actually think that's a fantastic idea. So I'm gonna boil 9 lasagna noodles for 8 minutes. And I'm going to defrost my tomato sauce, which has ground beef in it. Now you need a lot of sauce to make lasagna the right way. It needs to be saucy and juicy and all the things, so don't skip out on the sauce when you make this recipe. Make, and if you're going to do it in the crock pot, make and save more than you think you would ever need. So if you pre-make your tomato sauce like I do, when you go to defrost it, make sure that you actually warm it up. You don't want to just defrost it and have cold sauce when you layer up your lasagna, because it's going to take it way longer to bake. So when you defrost it, go on and heat it up. It needs to be pretty warm so that when you layer your lasagna, everything is hot to begin with. So while my noodles are boiling, I'm going to mix up my cheesy layer. So in a small bowl, I'm going to add 12 ounces of small curd cottage cheese, salt and pepper, my mom did not have this in her recipe, but I'm sure she added onion powder and garlic powder to this as well. I'm just going to eyeball this, just a smidge. Give that a little toss. And I'm going to add 2 eggs. Give that a mix. And then my mother's instructions literally says, cover mixture in Parmesan cheese. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. About like that, I think. And mix that again. And I'm going to set this aside and prepare my casserole dish. When I do other lasagnas, I use your typical 9 by 13 baking dish. But for my mother's lasagna, I am going to use a smaller dish, simply because I want a thick layered lasagna, not something that is thin. So if I use a regular size casserole dish, and you have everything laid out, you're going to end up with a thin lasagna. I want a lasagna that is really stacked high, so I'm going to shorten my dish. And give this a spray with some cooking oil, just for good measure. Now we're ready to layer. So my noodles have been cooking for 8 minutes. They're done, and I'm going to drop them into a colander and let them drain, because I don't want wet, soggy noodles. So the first thing I'm going to do is measure my noodle. This is a full-size lasagna noodle, and I know it's not going to fit in this pan. So I'm going to measure one noodle, kind of make a mark. Take that noodle out, cut off the excess, and I'm going to do the rest exactly like that. So now that my noodles are trimmed and ready, I'm going to take a little bit of my sauce and put it in the bottom of this dish, because you never want to put your noodles directly onto the baking dish. It's just going to stick. Then I'm going to take my little pieces here that I cut off. They're going to be my first layer. Okay, now, because we don't want to waste our noodles, so a little more sauce. Spread that around. Good and juicy. Now we get started. So 3 layers of noodles. Sauce. A layer of that cottage cheese and parmesan mixture. I'm going to use half of it. Spread that in. About 1 cup of shredded mozzarella cheese. Another layer of noodles. We're going to repeat what we just did. the rest of our cottage cheese mixture. Another handful, about a cup, of mozzarella cheese. Then our last layer of lasagna noodles. And so that our noodles don't burn on the top when they're in the oven, we're going to top it with this last little bit of sauce, just a little layer. This protects the noodles. And then just a little light layer of mozzarella cheese along the top. Then my mom's recipe doesn't technically say this, but I feel like she would have put a little bit of parmesan on the top too, knowing my mom. So I'm going to cover this whole casserole dish in a piece of aluminum foil. Cover tightly. And I know my mom would always put her casserole dish on top of a baking sheet. That way it's a lot easier to pick up and handle. So bake your lasagna in a 375-degree oven. Make sure your oven was preheated, and you're going to bake it for a total of about 40 to 45 minutes. However, set a timer for 20 minutes. Take the lasagna out, remove that aluminum foil. This lets the internal temperature of the lasagna heat up, and then put it back in the oven for about another 20 or 25 minutes. This is when your lasagna really will start to cook, and you know it's done when the top is golden brown, it's bubbly, the cheese is melted, the edges just kind of have that great brown, crispy look to it. Look how good this is. And y'all, I got to tell you something. My dad walked in my house about 10 minutes before the lasagna was going to be done. And I said, well, Dad, you're early. And he said, well, I just wanted to come over. I wanted to smell it. I know it's going to smell like your mom. Made me tear up. But he was here. We chatted. I got out the lasagna. I had to cut it really well with a sharp knife because you're cutting through about 4 layers of lasagna noodles and cheese. Run your knife along the outside edge as well just to get everything loose. And make sure before you cut your lasagna, you let it set for about 10 to 15 minutes because you want it to cool down and the sauce will really thicken up as it sets. And then use a spatula and dig in and look at that cheesy goodness. Oh, so good. So that's my mom's original lasagna recipe. It was so good, just saucy and cheesy and goodness, and it just took me back to my childhood, and my dad really enjoyed it too. If you all love that recipe, I would be delighted for you to make it for your family. See you in the next video.